Of all the countless books, magazine articles and documentaries released over the decades focusing solely in on that brief era back in the 1960s, the so-called counterculture, of all of them, I think it's safe to conclude that, certainly by my estimations, the overwhelming majority have, whether via the medium of the mainstream or the often labelled alternative media, almost entirely been dedicated to presenting the American perspective, to what is said to have been going on in California, most notably, to be more precise, the Haight-Ashbury district in San Francisco. What's close to almost having never been a focus of historians, researchers and commentators and presenters is what was happening at the same time over the Atlantic in Britain's counterculture scene. For whatever reason, there has been, unfairly so, a near to almost non-existent level of acknowledgement of the British presence in what was a short but significant cultural era that made its mark during the mid to late 1960s and a little beyond in what is termed the Western world. And as far as I'm concerned, that's quite a serious misrepresentation. I'm not denying or seeking to denigrate America's influence in the formation and widespread popularity of this movement amongst the youth at that time, only to argue that without Britain, it quite possibly might never have become as huge as it did. For example, here's some pointers for you. 4 pointers. Point 1. There's British-born Michael Hollingshead, the self-styled man who turned on the world. He was the guy who gave Harvard professor Timothy Leary his first LSD trip and, you might say, as a result, paved the way for his transformation into the acid guru who told his audiences in their thousands to turn on, tune in, drop out. Point 2, there's the word psychedelic, not only used to describe the LSD experience itself through the actual use of the drug, but also to label a style, a genre, a feel in music, fashion, photography, movies and other forms of art media that lend themselves to that vibe. This word, psychedelic, was coined by a British doctor, psychiatrist Humphrey Osmond. Point 3. Osmond was friends and a sometime collaborator of British-born philosopher and writer Aldous Huxley, deemed a godfather of the 60s countercultural scene, thanks in large part to his mescaline-soaked journal The Doors of Perception, which is said to have inspired the band name The Doors, one of the late 1960s most successful music groups. Additionally, John Lennon is said to have regarded Huxley as the governor. And with regards to Lennon and his fellow British bandmates the Beatles, and this brings me to point 4, their 1967 album Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band has been heralded as the soundtrack of the so-called Summer of Love, the period in 1967 in the Haight-Ashbury when, it said, the district was converged upon by an estimated 100,000 young people looking to adopt the countercultural ideal of free living, including so-called free love and drugs, communal peace and music from such contemporary favourites as the Jefferson Airplane and the Grateful Dead. Given that the Beatles were arguably the most famous, commercially successful and influential band of the 1960s, and with a mass appeal that spanned the generational divides, having them as the flag wave bearers of the counterculture, which they very much were, would have been a major boost to the popularity and sustainability of that scene in America, let alone in Britain and the rest of the world. So, with these pointers in mind, it's my view that if indeed the 1960s counterculture was a social engineering psyop, as a number of researchers, authors, podcasters and other public speakers have argued within the earlier mentioned alternative medium, then it only seems natural to me that Britain would have been integral to its implementation, perhaps even on an even larger scale than the endlessly more reported on America. Certainly, the names I've cited, Huxley, Osmond, Hollingshead and the Beatles, have all to one degree or another been linked in some shape or form to elements that are accused of having been instrumental in manipulating the cultural direction of that decade, such as, of course, the Intelligence services, military and think tanks and agents of cultural change such as the Fabian Society and the Tavistock Institutes, to name but only two. I'm sharing my research here not to cajole you into believing that what I'm presenting is proof positive that the British 60s underground movement and indeed the American 1960s counterculture was a psyop operation by the military intelligence government complex. I'm merely setting out the information for you to look at, to consider, laying out the evidence, as it were, in a neat, digestible form so that you can make up your own mind about it all. If nothing else, even if you come away from all of this not convinced, I hope you'll have found it to have been enlightening, interesting and educational too. So, what exactly was the 60s counterculture, or to be more precise within the British context, the underground? It was an alternative form of living for those predominantly who'd been born in the 1940s and were in their late teens and early to mid-20s once the 1960s had arrived. A lifestyle option, that's what it was. A lifestyle option that was radically different to that of their parents' generation as well as of their parents' parents. In came a liberalisation of attitudes towards drug use, particularly marijuana and LSD, and sex, deference to the so-called establishment, and figures within authority slackened as well, so we're told, especially toward government and the police, in varying degrees, sometimes violently, especially in the US. Heads of universities fought against the protests of their students as they argued for the right to free speech on campus, or in opposition to the military conflict that was raging in that decade into the next in Vietnam, and other perceived injustices and acts of violence elsewhere across the continents. Also worth mentioning here, there are some people who were there in the midst of it back then in the 1960s who chose this alternative option for living, who were born in the 1940s and late 30s, who have said it was a lifestyle choice that was in part an act of rebellion against their parents' generation. An expression of anger and disappointment aimed at their parents' generation for allowing a Second World War to come into existence. Also, the onset of the so-called Cold War in the 1950s and the fears among the mass population of nuclear annihilation as a result, especially in October 1962 over what's known as the Cuban Missile Crisis, when the governments of the Soviet Union and the US were, as reported, in a standoff that nearly led to a full-scale nuclear conflict. That was another reason for the young of the time to engage in wild fun and abandon to the pleasures that the 1960s was offering them. Because, after all, who knew when that atom bomb would bring it all to a sudden, decisive end? They wanted to party like there was no tomorrow. Depending on what book you read or video presentation you watch or podcast or radio interview you hear, there are a small variety of reasons given by authors and researchers and commentators as to why the 60s counterculture underground movement was, if not a totally engineered psyop, then at least co-opted and compromised to socially engineer. One of those reasons that's given is that it was a way to neutralise effective protest against the Vietnam War. Of course, this is more applicable to the US than Britain. Britain chose not to deploy forces into the conflict. In America, the escalation of US troops in Vietnam in 1965 and the consequent eruption of a full-scale war from that point there led to protest marches and gatherings attended in their hundreds and thousands during the second half of the 60s and into the early 70s, with the younger generation noticeably included in this. Although there was no direct military involvement by Europe, protesters in that part of the world did take up the cause. Denmark, Germany, Sweden, Belgium and Italy made their voice heard, as did the UK, with a demonstration outside the US Embassy in London, most notably in 1968. The claim is, is that the so-called powers that be, in a bid to thwart unrest against the war amongst the young, introduced the mind-altering powers of LSD onto the streets and at music events and other social gatherings in the 1960s, and it quickly became a drug of mass consumption. Another reason that's given for the social engineering in the 60s was it was there to destroy traditional family values and to debase society. The permissive society is a term used to describe the liberalisation of social norms in the 60s, especially with regards to sexual behaviour. So-called free love is usually mentioned in that context. According to British journalist Virginia Ironside, who described her own personal experiences as a single young woman during the 1960s for an article for the British news source The Mail Online in 2011, she stated, "To be honest, I mainly remember the 60s as an endless round of miserable promiscuity. Girls of the 60s eventually became fairly jaded about sex. It took me years to discover that continual sex with different partners is, with very few exceptions, joyless, uncomfortable, and humiliating." Both the US and UK saw the introduction of the contraceptive pill during that decade, giving women freedom to sleep around without the risk of pregnancy, whether they were unmarried or not. According to the book The Conspirators' Hierarchy, the Committee of 300, authored by self-confessed former intelligence operative John Coleman and published in the 1990s, the, and I quote, "destroying of the family unit in the 1960s was an integral part of the conspiracy," he claimed, to bring about a one-world government, depopulation, destruction of national pride and religion, the end of industrialisation, suppression of all scientific development, and the weakening of people's moral fibre. The youth of the land, he claimed, will be encouraged by means of rock music and drugs to rebel against the status quo. This would lead to the undermining and then destruction of the family unit. That's according to John Coleman. Jan Irvin and Joe Atwill, landmark researchers in the field of US counterculture conspiracy, argue that the aim of the 60s PSYOP was to establish, in their words, a neo-feudalism, a retrograde culture, by debasing, with the use of psychedelics, the intellectual abilities of young people in order to make them easily controllable as serfs of the so-called Dark Ages. In my own subsequent analysis, these reasons will feature in one shape or form, as will more, much more, and from a British perspective, of course. Initially, back in 2016, when I began my research into the 60s underground and any potential sign of it having been a PSYOP, I directed very little, if any, focus towards how that scene will have affected the shape of this world, what we're living through today, the issues, topics and incidents that touch our lives in one way or another on a day-to-day basis. I was only focused on the 1960s itself, and with the preceding decades before it, if and only if their influence was perhaps a contributory factor. My focus since has shifted to include what's happening today, within the context of how it might relate directly to what was occurring back in the 60s. In other words, the cause and effect of the social engineering project that was the underground, the counterculture. For example, the so-called environmentalism movement is said to have picked up a pace in the 1960s, what has since become the climate change agenda, the birth of internet chat forums and the swapping of information over social media platforms is credited with having its roots in the 60s counterculture too. That's thanks in part to people within the countercultural scene who were pursuing a life out on the land back then, away from the cities and towns, and who were turning to the Whole Earth Catalogue to aid them in this. The Whole Earth Catalogue was a magazine first published in 1968 and the brainchild of a guy by the name of Stuart Brand. Here's what Professor Fred Turner author of From Counterculture to Cyberculture, Stuart Brand, The Whole Earth Network and the Rise of Digital Utopianism, had to say a few years back about Brand and the influence of his Whole Earth catalogue.
Let's talk now a little bit about the Whole Earth Catalog, and was arguably the most visible and influential publication in the American counterculture. So Stuart Brand, the founder, along with his wife Lois Brand, his father died, left him a small amount of money, and he was wondering what to do with it, how to affect social change. He was living in San Francisco, or near San Francisco. He was actually living at the edge of Stanford in this period, and he saw that a number of his friends from San Francisco were heading back to the land. He and his wife, Lois, put together a list of tools they thought people might need back on the land, and brought that list, handwritten, out into the hinterland, saw what people needed, then came back to Menlo Park in California, near Stanford, and created the catalog. The other interesting thing about the catalog is that it didn't actually sell anything. You couldn't buy anything in the catalog. The catalog was what Brand called a pointing device. Each item would contain a listing of the item, a description, and then a description of where you could buy it elsewhere. Each item was also mailed in by a reader after the first edition. Brand did the first one, but then after that he solicited readers. So readers wrote in, recommended products, and told people where to get them. Does that sound like the internet to you? It sure did to me. And it turns out that Alan Kay, one of the designers of the early MacBook, was in fact very influenced in his design of early interfaces by the Whole Earth Catalog. Think about 1968. No internet, no cell phone, slow mail, regular landline telephones. You start a little commune in your town. How do you know who is doing a commune in Colorado, New Mexico, Canada? You don't, unless you write and find friends. The catalog becomes a map of the commune world in this period. It becomes a forum for countercultural networks to meet each other, in print first, and then ultimately in conferences. The whole system framework is one that enters the counterculture not from hippie rebellion.
Well, not from hippie rebellion. That's what he says there. I'll latch onto that in a second. Co-founder of the Apple computer empire, Steve Jobs, said of the Whole Earth Catalogue, "When I was young, there was an amazing publication called the Whole Earth Catalogue. It was sort of like Google in paperback form 35 years before Google came along." Now, here's some suspicions to mention regarding the catalogue's founder, Stuart Brand, this man who, in Professor Turner's words, wanted to affect social change. Earlier in the 1960s, before his magazine was a reality, he'd been an active member of the Merry Pranksters, a group of friends and associated folk that included, so I'm led to understand, although I might have miscalculated, a few writers and at least one poet and a dancer, a waitress, an art student and university professor, and they all went travelling around America together in a bus taking LSD at a time when the drug wasn't yet known to the public at large, but was most certainly being bought and used in gigantic quantities by certain quarters within the military and intelligence services, including the CIA and its MKUltra mind control program, which conducted all manner of experiments on human guinea pigs, knowing and unknowing, from a wide range of society, including university students who were paid to volunteer for tests in which they were administered with the substance. Ken Kesey, perhaps best known for authoring the hit novel One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest, was a fellow prankster of Brand's and one such test subject. And there was Robert Hunter, lyricist of the Grateful Dead, a band that had established itself by performing at LSD parties organised by the pranksters called acid tests. He too was a volunteer of MKUltra experiments while studying at the very same university where Kesey was. Fancy that, eh? What are the chances? Decades later, recalling the past, both Hunter and Kesey claimed to have had no knowledge that what they'd volunteered for back then was CIA-backed. Believe that or not. whatever, it was a few short years after their participation in those experiments in university that Ken was offering LSD himself to the attendees of the acid tests at a time when the general public was largely unaware of the drug's existence. Effectively, what was happening was the Cuckoo's Nest author was introducing the substance to the wider world and, in effect, you might say, helping to engineer society as desired by the military intel complex. To quote one of the pranksters, the acid tests were more about getting the psychedelic experience out into the public, a way to get the acid out of the hands of the CIA and into the hands of the general public. Aiding this along, in January 1966 was the 3-day Trips Festival in San Francisco, organised by prankster Stuart Brand. In the years before he helped to spread the gospel of acid and then later influenced, it said, the course of the internet, between 1960 and 1963, he was an officer in the US military. So he had quite a shift around in life's path, you might think. But really, that's not at all unusual. Once you've totted up the backgrounds and connections of a number of movers and shakers within the 60s counterculture underground. And this is what underpins the vast extent of the narrative that I'll be presenting over the chapters. And if you're versed already in the not as widely known history of the 60s so-called counterculture, then this will be no shocker to you, of course, and it'd be no surprise to me at all if you were to say to me that the reason for your familiarity with this perspective, this particular perspective on the 1960s, is thanks in some sized part to the research of David McGowan. As far as I'm concerned, within the realm of music conspiracy research, David McGowan, who passed away in 2015, was a pioneer thanks to his work looking into the 1960s counterculture in the US. Sure, there were researchers before him who'd investigated that same era, its musical landscape, focusing in on the conspiratorial within the area of social engineering. But what he brought to the subject, like no other previously, was an emphasis on certain famous musicians and singers of the late 60s who, on the face of it, might have appeared to have been spokespeople of the younger generation, vehemently opposed to the Vietnam War, but whose backgrounds actually were intimately connected to the military and or intelligence, government and so-called elite families. The accusation being that, far from standing up for the cause against armed US intervention, they are actually agents working on behalf of the intel community in order to, in David's words, create a fake opposition that could be easily directed and as a result discredited with the help of LSD, of course. Also, he contended that, contrary to popular opinion, the anti-Vietnam War movement was not exclusively the domain of the so-called hippies, the name given to society's young, counterculture-loving, flower-wearing population. Yeah, of course, hippies were present and active in that cause during the late 1960s, but, McGowan pointed out, protests against the US's military involvement had been occurring long before the countercultural scene took shape. It was the mass media, he argued, that was responsible for portraying it otherwise, in order to present the anti-Vietnam War movement to the general public as being entirely, in David McGowan's words, a ragtag band of unwashed, drug-fueled individuals sporting flowers and peace symbols. Further increasing McGowan's suspicions with regards to the famous musicians and singers during the 1960s that he perceived to be intel-backed agents of a fake opposition was that a rather high volume of them converged upon and lived in the very same LA neighbourhood of Laurel Canyon, almost simultaneously, and mainstream accounts inform us spontaneously too, at a time when Los Angeles had no music industry or live gig scene. So, an odd part of the world to move to for an aspiring musician, McGowan argued. What this location did provide, though, between 1947 and 1969 was top secret propaganda and informational films for the US military and Air Force via its clandestine military movie studio there, the Lookout Mountain Air Force Station. In its canon, in the Lookout Mountain Air Force Station's canon are included film releases that celebrated the force's involvement in Vietnam during the 1960s, propaganda films such as from 1966 To Have a Soldier, and from 1967 Another Day of War, the US Air Force in Vietnam. McGowan put forward the scenario that it wasn't a coincidence that these musicians and singers converged upon Laurel Canyon. It was because there was a secret military installation there, the Lookout Mountain Movie Studio. Some of the 60s best-known music stars who moved to this LA neighbourhood during that decade included Mama Cass and Michelle Phillips of the Mamas and the Papas, Joni Mitchell, members of the band Canned Heat, Neil Young, Graham Nash and Stephen Stills, and others, many others. In his book, Weird Scenes Inside the Canyon, Laurel Canyon, Covert Ops and the Dark Heart of the Hippie Dream, McGowan provides us with a detailed list of the famous names from music who resided there during the 60s and their backgrounds before fame came upon them. For instance, there's David Crosby, former member of the band The Byrds, and who, with the earlier mentioned Nash, Stills and Young, formed one part of the collective Crosby, Stills, Nash and Young. To quote from McGowan's book, Crosby is, not surprisingly, the son of World War II military intelligence officer Major Floyd Delafield Crosby. But David is much more than just the son of Major Delafield Crosby. David Van Cortlandt Crosby, as it turns out, is a scion of the closely intertwined Van Cortlandt, Van Schuyler and Van Rensselaer families. And while you're probably thinking, the Van who families? I can assure you that if you plug those names in over at Wikipedia, you can spend a pretty fair amount of time reading up on the power wielded by this clan for the last, 2.25 centuries or so. Suffice it to say that the Crosby family tree includes a dizzying array of US senators and congressmen, state senators and assemblymen, governors, mayors, judges, Supreme Court justices, Revolutionary and Civil War generals, signers of the Declaration of Independence, and members of the Continental Congress. It also includes, I should hasten to add, for those of you with a taste for such things, Stephen Van Rensselaer III, for example, reportedly served as Grand Master of Masons for New York. Then there's Frank Zappa, to quote McGowan again. Frank's dad, Francis Zappa, was a chemical warfare specialist assigned to the Edgewood Arsenal near Baltimore, Maryland. Edgewood is, of course, the longtime home of America's chemical warfare program. Curiously enough, Frank Zappa literally grew up at the Edgewood Arsenal, having lived the first 7 years of his life in military housing on the grounds of the facility. The family later moved to Lancaster, California, near Edwards Air Force Base, where Francis Zappa continued to busy himself doing classified work for the military intelligence complex. But perhaps the most compelling of all the examples mentioned by McGowan in his book is that of Jim Morrison of the Doors. His father was none other than US Navy Rear Admiral George Stephen Morrison, fleet commander during the so-called Gulf of Tonkin incident off the South China Sea in 1964, a false flag non-event that essentially started the Vietnam War. Now, what is said to have happened at the time, this false flag non-event, what's said to have happened at the time was, whilst patrolling the seas on August the 2nd that year, 1964, an American destroyer, the USS Maddox, was attacked by North Vietnamese torpedoes and was so again on the 4th, along with the USS Turner Joy. It was this reported second round of attacks that prompted the then President of the United States, Lyndon B. Johnson, to successfully pass through Congress the Gulf of Tonkin resolution, which basically handed him the authority to send into Vietnam more of the US military, which he did, upping its previously minimal troop presence there into a full-scale war. Now, decades later, it was publicly admitted that there was actually no attack by the North Vietnamese against the destroyers on August the 4th. And that's what Robert McNamara, President Johnson's Secretary of Defence at the time, said, basically stating, in other words, that the Vietnam War was launched on lies. Now, what David McGowan didn't mention in his book is the fact that if you look closer through the doors, you'll see that the military connections don't stop at Jim Morrison. The keyboardist, Ray Manzarek, some years before his recording career began, had enlisted in the US Army and then got transferred into the Army Intelligence Service and was stationed on the Japanese island of Okinawa. And the guitarist, Robbie Krieger, his father, according to his father's obituary, after graduating from university in aeronautical engineering and helping to design warplanes during World War II, went on to work for Northrop Grumman, which is, according to its website, and I quote, an American multinational aerospace and defence technology company that has dealt in and continues to deal in contracts to provide data procurement for the Department of Defence and various intelligence services, and has supplied electronic warfare and information dominance technologies, as well as provided information technology services to defence and intelligence agencies. That's according to its website. What McGowan does mention in his book with regards to Jim Morrison is that he reportedly went to school with Adelaide Sloatman, who would go on to marry the earlier mentioned Frank Zappa. Such a small world, eh? And she hailed from, according to David, and I quote, a long line of career naval officers, including her father, who spent his life working on classified nuclear weapons research for the US Navy. Well, of course he did. Now, what of the UK? So what of the UK then? What of the British equivalents to the suspicious-looking residents and main players of Laurel Canyon, according to McGowan's findings? Well, for me personally, the initial realisation that the countercultural community in 1960s Britain, and predominantly in London, was perhaps operating within an identical conspiratorial framework, give or take a detail here and there, was after watching the 2013 DVD-only release Going Underground, Paul McCartney, the Beatles and the UK Counterculture, a documentary tracing not only Paul McCartney's exploration and involvement into and in the London underground scene of the 1960s, but its history too, featuring interviews and recollections with many of its key movers and shakers, including John Hoppy Hopkins, who is regarded by his peers as its de facto leader, its flag wave bearer, its instigator, and what I discovered upon watching the DVD, originating from a background that included time working as a nuclear physicist for the British government. Very Laurel Canyon-esque, I thought to myself. Enough so that it was a major factor in my decision back in 2016 or thereabouts to begin looking further into the UK counterculture scene of the 60s for more of the same. The way I saw it, if the US version was a psyop, then so was the UK's, given that Britain was integral to the popularity, if not also the formation of the movement on both sides of the Atlantic, as I explained earlier. Now, in Chapter 1, I begin my alternative history of the British London underground scene with John Hoppy Hopkins, partly because his background does contain characteristics within it that are Laurel Canyon-esque. He's by no means the only Brit from the 60s underground contingent with such a pedigree. Oh no. But he's the ideal starting point, I think, because he is deemed to have been the head figure of the countercultural collective of London, the first name in its pecking order. So that's where I begin it, before going further back in time a little bit to one of the roots of, you might say, this psyop, before fast forwarding to the 60s again. But before you focus in on chapter 1, please do allow me a little bit more of your time here to explain exactly what I personally mean when I mention or refer to the counterculture era. The way I see it from a British pop cultural perspective, the 1960s is split into 3 parts. Okay, the first is the hangover period, so that's 1960 to 1963. Then it's the swinging 60s, which is 1963 to 1966, and then the onset of the underground scene, predominantly in London, in the later part of 1966. Based on what I've observed from various history books I've read and documentaries I've viewed, for a number of people who grew up in Britain after the end of World War II and right the way through into the 1950s, life was socially stifling. It was austere. The country had come out of the war in 1945 in financial debt and disarray, and aesthetically with its cities and towns left blighted by bomb damage. Also, if that wasn't enough to make one living through it at the time feel somewhat despondent, wartime rationing of certain foodstuffs and clothes and petrol, introduced as part of measures to deal with an inevitable national shortage during the war, so we're informed, continued well after the end of World War II into the 50s, to 1954 to be exact. It included restrictions on meat, eggs, milk, flour, butter, tea and sugar. Although the rise in prominence of the teenager began to pick up a pace towards the latter half of the 1950s, pushed along by the advent in that decade of rock and roll and all other youthly pursuits of an American invention, Britain itself at that time was still in its hangover from the war. As an example of this, there's Trinidadian-born Horace Ove, who went on to make his name in the UK as a filmmaker and who also mingled within the underground scene. He said of London, "When I arrived in 1960, it still felt like after the war. It was very grey and people wore black and they wore grey and they were very formal, and even the guy digging up the street would be wearing a suit. There was a heavy cloud over it." John Dunbar, who was married to Marianne Faithfull during the second half of the 1960s, who eventually left him for Mick Jagger in that decade, he said, "Just the whole thing with the 50s in England, the post-war thing, it was very, all the cars were black. I mean, it was just extraordinarily dull." Britain was a black and white world. Then, in 1963, came the beginning of a renaissance in British pop culture. It was like someone had flicked a switch and Britain clicked from black and white to Technicolor. That's how it's been described by people who were there at the time, who'd grown up in that hangover period before it. This Technicolor was accentuated by the youthful soundtrack of the Beatles and those other music groups that burst through behind them, including the Rolling Stones, the Kinks and the Who. This was the swinging 60s, what I would describe as the era between 1963 to mid to late 1966, as I said earlier, although other commentators might, and indeed do, position the time frame differently, as well as what it represented. But for me, what I envisage when I think of this period is an image in my mind's eye of a pop cultural landscape dominated by British influence, outweighing the reliance on what was happening stateside during those earlier hangover days of the UK, especially amongst the young. Now it was Britain that was leading the way. There was Mary Quant, the much hailed inventor of the miniskirt, a defining and monumentally popular invention during those years. This was also the era of the men's combed-down mop-top hairstyle, as made famous by the Beatles, of course. And there was London's Carnaby Street, the place to buy your fab threads. And it was the period that saw the rise in fame of David Bailey, a young British fashion photographer who snapped many of the coolest and vital stars of the UK in that era. I also think of the abstract James Bond-esque spy-fi TV hit The Avengers, with its surreal mix of old and new Britain, teaming together the lead character, the bowler-hatted, debonair, middle-aged, vintage car-driving secret agent John Steed, with young female crime-fighting glamourpuss partners dressed in ultra-fashionable 60s outfits. It was the rise of the mod. It was the era of the rise of the mod, a very fashion-conscious movement with music tastes that veered strongly at that time towards jazz, soul, rhythm and blues, as well as The Who and the Small Faces. And most of the popular music bands of that era were suited up, as were a large contingent of the mods, of course. But the oncoming next phase, the underground era, from late 1966, would see a drastic transformation in this respect. The counterculture era of 60s Britain that saw out the decade had been germinating for quite some time before it came into prominence. It'd been bubbling away since the very early 1960s, in fact, but it wasn't until 1966 that it began to make its influence felt in the wider world, as did LSD, one of its main drugs of choice, introduced into widespread consciousness during the middle of that year, 1966, resulting in its growing consumption and popularity among the general public by early 1967. Its effect on those who ingested it helped to inform the direction of the contemporary culture of the time, both underground and overground. Music, movies, fashion design, arts and mass advertising, they all got immersed in the psychedelic, and the term psychedelia was used to describe this as a genre. The previously mentioned Technicolor world that came into being in 1963, that had cancelled out that black and white hangover period before it, it went trippy. But as I outlined earlier, the so-called counterculture era was about more than this, whatever side of the Atlantic it was going on. For example, within the realms of spirituality, there was the mass popularisation of Hinduism and New Age beliefs. And there was a lot of other activity going on away from the mainstream, deep in the underground, and much of which would have been viewed by the regular man and woman on the street as, I'd suggest, somewhat frightening, criminalistic, perverted, sadistic, cruel, certainly weird, evil even. Perhaps worth noting also is not every young person who dived into and enjoyed the Technicolor swinging phase of the 60s chose to stick around during the counterculture period. Many found it a bit too drug-infested for their liking, maybe even a tad grubby. This is certainly the impression I've been given from accounts I've read of those who were around at the time, and also by a gentleman I knew personally, who sadly has since passed away. He was a sharp-dressed mod in the first half of the 1960s, who found the later LSD-laced scene not to his taste. I should have asked him, but I never did, to my regret, what it was exactly that he found so distasteful about it. If I was to guess, my guess is that he was probably none too impressed at the time with the shifting, slackening attitude of his peers, basically, observing young men of a similar age to him binning that earlier suit-wearing era in exchange for flared baggy jeans, T-shirts and increasingly longer hair and beards, as well as the consciousness-bending drugs. This would have been largely unheard of, unseen in the UK and US at the beginning of that decade of the 1960s. Compare the pop cultural timeline of 1960 to 1969, and they're almost like two separate worlds. In the decades since the 1960s, social commentators and narrators have judged the so-called counterculture within a historical context of peace and love and flowers, but there was an uglier element to it too. Dark depths.